Thank you for having me. I mean, I'm just delighted and honored to be a part of Teal around the world. And I had the opportunity to meet some of Romina's colleagues late last year as we celebrated the life and legacy of Tony Hsieh out in Las Vegas. And I've just been so honored to be invited to be a part of this event that you're creating and get to learn from all of you and to be included in these dialogues that I think are really on the forefront of how we enhance and effectively up-level how we think about human capital and people in the workforce. And this idea of, as Rhea says, making people say, what is it, Monday? Like they're excited about Monday.
It's hilarious. I haven't heard that.
Get people, yeah. She talks about getting people excited, moving from, I think, like the Sunday scaries to Monday. And so how we effectively support people in bringing their whole selves to work. And of course, I think as we see across the globe, we're really in a moment of amplified concerns around mental health, around well-being. And as we're spending at least 8 to 10 hours of our day inside of work, thinking about in our places of work, how we get to positively contribute to having a beautiful mindset, to feeling great about the work that we do, to being able to bring ourselves holistically to the work that we do each and every day, and to feel like rather than work draining us, it ultimately becomes a place and a space where we can be uplifted, where we can uplift ourselves, where we can uplift others and co-elevate inside of our roles and with our jobs. So what I'm just excited to talk to you about today is the 5 practices of highly resilient people, why some flourish and others fold. And with this dialogue, what's really exciting to me to start off with is a concept that is incredibly pivotal as we have conversations about resilience. I think you all can appreciate that resilience, when we're able to harness it, is one of the most powerful facets of what it means to be human. And yet there are also moments where resilience can be weaponized, where resilience is used in such a way that it doesn't uplift or uplevel us. And I think one of those ways is coming into these conversations, there's sometimes a sense of dread, right? So if you think about work-life balance, right? We all think, wow, work-life balance, that sounds like a great idea, work-life integration. And then I think to myself, what if I find out that my life is deeply unbalanced? What if I'm going to come away from this dialogue feeling worse than I did when I came in? And I think there's a corollary to resilience in that sense, where people also come in with this sense of dread, where it's like, what am I going to find out about myself? Am I going to like this? Am I going to find out that I'm lacking or wanting in this area of resilience and leave feeling worse than when I did when I came in? And so the good news for all of us is that resilience is the essence of what it means to be human. And I think when we start from this perspective that we don't have to go out and look for resilience, this isn't something we need to find, that it's fundamentally part of who we are as being a human, the essence of what it means to be human, that it goes in tandem with our humanity, then we can all relax into the idea that we are enough. We can all relax into the idea that we have a requisite amount of resilience. And this is incredibly powerful. As I've spent the last 2 decades interviewing people, I asked them one simple and powerful question to begin to understand, are there commonalities that exist between all of us in terms of how we effectively face challenge, change, and complexity? And so you might want to reflect on this question for yourself as well. And the question is, when you've faced significant challenge or challenges in the past, what have you done to effectively address those challenges? So now, having interviewed hundreds of people and collected thousands of pieces of data on this topic, This has given rise to the framework, the 5 practices of highly resilient people. Or in the moments when we face challenge, what are the 5 things that any of us can do to create a more positive and productive outcome? And that's incredibly powerful as well, because what happens when challenge shows up in our lives? What's the first thing that we say to ourselves? We say, what am I going to do? And so this all started 20 years ago when I found commonalities between 2 groups that were seemingly similar. I was interviewing women that were living in rural Maryland that were grappling with either financial sustainability or food sustainability or both. And then several years later, I had the opportunity when I was on my pre and postdoctoral fellowship in neuropsychology to be working with patients that had had brain injuries and spinal cord injuries. And what I found in both of these groups is that transportation was in the days before Uber and Lyft, was the difference between these mothers being able to lift themselves out and their families out of poverty. And it was also the difference, statistically speaking, between people that had had brain injuries and spinal cord injuries. If you had access to reliable transportation, this is the difference, statistically speaking, between living independently and living in an assisted care facility. And so I got to thinking, well, if these 2 distinct groups have the same thing, transportation, in common that amplifies their resilience, what about the rest of us? Maybe there's a commonality that we can all engage in when we face challenge that will allow us to create a more positive and productive outcome. So spoiler alert, there are commonalities with all of us. And those are the 5 practices that we're going to touch on in our time together. But first, a definition. So when we talk about resilience, this is an important distinction. The first part is that challenge, change, and complexity were the 3 C's, as I call them. If resilience is the essence of being human, this is the fabric of what it means to be human. I think we've all realized in the past couple of years that we cannot engineer the 3 C's out of our lives. And so given that, we get to stop feeling ashamed when we face hardship. We get to stop feeling bad in moments where there's a disappointing turn of events or a rejection or a loss, because we know that this is the fabric of what it means to be here on this earth and part of our human experience. And so then what we get to do is we get to face these moments in a manner that ultimately enhances us and doesn't diminish us. And as we define resilience together, what's incredibly important is not only the words that are here on the page, but the words that are not here on the page, right? So oftentimes we've made resilience synonymous with quickly recovering. And yet in my work, what I've found is that sometimes the people that go back the fastest, go back to work the next day, go back to what they were doing, they haven't taken time to integrate and appreciate what's happened, what's changed in their lives. And ultimately, these are oftentimes people that have more difficulties later on because we came back too fast. There's another thing that you don't see here, and this is the idea of bouncing back. Like, when did resilience become synonymous with bouncing back, right? We're all in this kind of area of human development. And so we've all probably read at least one article on neuroplasticity, maybe safe to say. And what neuroplasticity tells us is that the neurons in our brains are constantly regenerating, rewiring, and regrouping in response to every single experience that we have. And so if we are fundamentally changed down to the neurological level, the cellular level, by every experience we have, why would we ever expect to go back to the way that we were, right? Instead, what we get to think about relative to resilience is this idea of bouncing forward, allowing ourselves to be changed by the experience, to adapt, to engage in learning, and then to go forward with a more holistic perspective based on that particular circumstance. There's a couple other myths about resilience that I want to just address with you briefly. The first, obviously, is bouncing back. So now we get to say we bounce forward. The next one is oftentimes we think about resilience as being fixed, right? Like we're just sort of given a certain amount of resilience and that's it. This is really evidenced, I think, in the language that people use around resilience. People will say, well, I'm just not resilient, or I've never been resilient, or maybe, I don't have what it takes, right? And so not only is resilience the essence of what it means to be human, right? Comes with that sort of human operating system. We also get to build our resilience over time in the way that we would build muscle or cardiovascular ability. So rather than thinking of resilience as being fixed, we get to think of it as being dynamic. And the last part is we often refer to resilience as being passive, right? It's being something that just kind of, happens, a program running in the background. And I think the way this shows up in language is we say things, at least in the English language, like time heals all wounds, right? That just sounds like time is going to passively pass and eventually we'll feel better. And instead, I think it's more akin to something that Andy Warhol said, which is time changes things and we get to change them ourselves. And so rather than thinking of resilience as being passive, right, we get to think of it as being an active pursuit of our growth and development. So I want to bring out just some vintage Stephen Covey for a minute, because I think this is important as we look at these 5 practices. Now, Stephen Covey obviously did, control the controllables. And in the center are the things that we can control, right? Our words or our language, our behavior, our mindset, our discretionary effort, how we show up, right? And in the outer circle are all the things we can't control, right? Other people's feelings, thoughts, their effort, right? And so when I show people this diagram, they're like, yes, I am aware of what I can control and what I cannot control, right? And that's important. But what I've also found in my travels is that just because we know what we can control and what we can't control doesn't mean that that's actually what we do. Because I've found that the average person spends 38% of their discretionary energy on the things that they can control, and 62% of our discretionary energy on the things outside of our control, right? So just because we know it doesn't mean we do it. Yeah. And so this for me was convicting, because what I thought to myself is, what if each of us just took back 30% of that discretionary energy in the outer ring? What if we spend 68% of our time on the things that we can control on the inside and less of our energy on the outside, right? And so we look again at kind of this, centerpiece, right? Thinking about for ourselves in a normal day, or when we face the 3 C's, challenge, change, and complexity, how we can spend more of our time in the core of ourselves and in the core of this circle around what we can actually control, and less of our time in the outside ring, spinning on things that are really outside of our ability to influence. And that brings me to the 5 practices of highly resilient people, because these are the 5 things that I've found in interviewing hundreds of people and collecting thousands of pieces of data that allow us to effectively create the best possible outcome when we face these challenging circumstances. And so as we spend this time together, I won't have an opportunity to go deeply into every practice, but I wanted to highlight them for you and sort of give you an overview. So the first one is vulnerability, right? So as I'm interviewing people, I'm hearing things about the ability for people to demonstrate what's happening in their lives and to be able to share that with others as being a key differentiator around how we flourish in challenging moments. And vulnerability is probably the next most misunderstood word after resilience, right? Vulnerability is not about demeaning yourself. It's not about being self-deprecating. It's not about pointing out flaws and putting yourself down. Vulnerability is simply about allowing our inside self, our thoughts, feelings, and experience to, as closely as possible, match our outside self, the self that we're sharing with the world. Now, will these two things, be farther apart or closer together depending on who we're with and what type of environment we're in? Absolutely. But this is powerful because when we are facing the 3 Cs, right, that already takes a lot of discretionary energy for us to deal with challenge. And then if our inside self, our thoughts, feelings, and our thoughts, feelings, and experience doesn't match the outside self that we're showing to the world. If inside we're freaking out and we're like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? And on the outside, we're like, no, everything's fine. I'm good. How are you? Right? We've got 2 human operating systems that are running simultaneously. So at the time when we need the most energy to figure things out, we're burning energetic capital by having these 2 things not be aligned. So vulnerability is about bringing ourselves together cohesively and coherently and making these things match more closely. And when we're able to demonstrate for people what's going on internally to show that to the outside world, that means we've got a better shot at resolving things because we're going to get support, we're going to get access, we're going to get information to solve our problems. Now, Brené Brown has talked quite a bit about vulnerability in popular conversation. And yet vulnerability is really a sticking point for so many of us. And when I speak to audiences, one of the questions I like to ask is, who here is living your most fabulous, vulnerable life? I've yet to have anybody raise their hand. And here's why. I discovered something else relative to vulnerability, and I call this the vulnerability bias. The vulnerability bias is the little voice that appears to be hardwired in our psyche, that anytime we say, you know what, I'm going to tell someone something about me, that voice shows up and says, that's a terrible idea. Don't do that. And in fact, if you do that, if you tell people that thing, the 3 L's will occur. People won't like you, they won't love you, and they might leave. And we're like, whoa, vulnerability bias. That is serious. I think I'm good right here. And I'm just not going to step out in my vulnerability and instead stay here in my little comfy vulnerability cage, right? And so acknowledging that when we think about humans evolutionarily, if we got separated or cut off from the pack, that meant certain death, right? So we were going to do everything we could to stay with the other humans to make sure that we could survive. But now things are different. Now, when we share something about ourselves that's vulnerable, it actually creates a deeper emotional connection, right? And we don't have to worry as much about the physical connection in order to survive. So the dynamics of what it means to survive are different. And rather than having a physical connection to survive today, it's about having an emotional connection to survive. And being able to deconstruct the vulnerability bias and to step outside of that irrational fear to share what is true for us ultimately leads to greater authenticity and greater empathy. Productive perseverance is our second practice. This is the intelligent pursuit of a goal. It's not as simple as saying, I'm going to put my head down and be gritty and get to that goal at all costs. And it's not as simple as giving ourselves the opportunity to quit or go in a new direction. It's really the art and the science of what it means to intelligently pursue a goal. And what that means is we're constantly collecting information about that goal on our journey. So it's about being able to continue toward an outcome in the face of challenge. And it's also a willingness to be flexible and pivot in the face of diminishing returns and constantly evaluating this for ourselves on our journey. The third practice of highly resilient people is connection. Connection, we think about oftentimes as being connections outside of ourselves. But first and foremost, this is the connection within ourselves. It's our own worthiness. It's our own enoughness. It's trusting our intuition. It's listening to that still small voice. It's knowing who we are, what our talents and strengths are, and being able to speak to those in a way that people can understand how we can contribute. And then being able to navigate the connection that we have with ourselves alongside all of our external connections that live in the world. The fourth practice of highly resilient people is gradiosity. Now, gradiosity, little known fact about qualitative research, you get to make up words apparently. So I took this on and thought, what are people trying to tell me about how they effectively face challenge? And what emerged for me is kind of this two-part element. The first part is gratitude, being able to look on an experience that we wouldn't have chosen, and to be able to say after some time, I can see the good in that. Even though I wouldn't have chosen that circumstance, I can see how things came out of that were of benefit. So after some time being able to look on our challenges with a sense of gratitude for the experience that we had, what we learned, how that pushed us in a new direction in our lives, how that exposed us to new opportunities. And then the osity part is generosity. And I think this is really at the epicenter of how we think about storytelling, because generosity is about sharing our resilience stories with others. We'll see a little bit more about that in a moment. And the fifth practice is the practice of possibility. This is a practice that privileges the focus on progress over perfection and allows us to evaluate the dichotomy, if you will, of opportunity and risk anytime we face challenge. That we don't over-index on going after an opportunity without thinking about the risk, and that we don't over-index on risk and allow that to keep us paralyzed. So let's try an exercise here to make this interactive. And this exercise is called the reverse bucket list. Okay, so we're all familiar with the bucket list, the pleasurable list of experiences that we've written down or in our minds that we want to have in this life while we're still here on the planet. Okay, so if that's the bucket list, the reverse bucket list is everything else. It's all the stuff we hoped to avoid. We hope to avoid health diagnosis. We hope to avoid rejection. We hope to avoid loss. We hope to avoid those disappointing turns of events, right? So the reflection opportunity here is to say, looking back, think of a time you effectively faced significant challenge and reflect on how has that challenge formed you into the person that you are today. Okay, so we're going to give you the gift of having this reflective moment for 2 to 3 minutes in your own space to think about your own reverse bucket list moment or moments, to look back on a time when you've effectively faced challenge or challenges. And now fast forwarding to today, how has this challenge formed you into the person that you are today? And if you're getting a little stuck somewhere along the way, finding a challenge, thinking about the formation, thinking about the impact, how has that created the person that you are? You can also consider these things here, right? Like, what was your mindset in that moment? Or how did your mindset shift? What was your support system like? Maybe your support system became amplified in some way, or you learned in that moment who was really going to show up for you. Thinking about what those circumstances were and how you effectively moved through them relative to your personal strengths that you noticed, or resources that you had, or knowledge or abilities that maybe came to the fore, you became aware of. So we want to give you maybe just 2 or 3 minutes to have this moment of reflection. So I think I'm going to be quiet. I'm going to mute for a second. Let's give us an opportunity to reflect. Is that okay with you, Romina? Reflection okay?
That's great. 2 minutes is great. And we'll keep going with the Q&A shortly thereafter. Thank you.
Beautiful.
I wish I had music. I could have put some music on.
All right, just in the interest of time, we'll keep going. But if you're mid-reflection, stay where you are, stay with the process. All right. So as I think about the story that I wanted to tell about my own resilience, I thought it was important to first share what is a resilience story. And our resilience stories oftentimes are the stories that we most don't want to tell, oddly enough, and the stories that need to be told. Oftentimes, our most critical or pivotal moments are moments that we hide from the world because we feel ashamed about the challenge that we faced, or with regard to the vulnerability bias, we wonder if people will look at us differently. And yet, by telling our resilience stories or sharing our resilience stories, we create a map to our own resilience, to our own strengths, to our own talents, right? And we also bring people up behind us. We allow people to vicariously live through these moments of challenge, change, and complexity with us. And we shine a light on other people's paths that are coming up behind us. And whether we know it or not, sharing our resilience stories oftentimes can become part of someone else's survival guide. So I thought about a story that I thought would be fun to share. This is a story of trick-or-treating with my older son. Seems like it wants to quit. Hopefully that won't happen. If my Zoom crashes, I'll be right back. Don't worry. But I have had this issue. So
It seems we've lost Taryn Marie. Dr. Taryn Marie.
but I'm back.
Oh, and she's back.
Ta-da!
Oh.
I know my Zoom started doing this weird thing. I need to fix it. So
all good.
I was out trick-or-treating with my sons, and we live in Philadelphia. Philadelphia is a big Halloween town. It's probably Halloween and Eagles around here are two big pastimes. So we're out trick-or-treating, and we find
I think we're having some audio issues. Dr. Taryn Marie, it could be that we can't hear you because there's a video playing. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me, Romina?
I can hear you now. Thank you. I couldn't. Are you playing a video by any chance? Because I don't think it.
I was playing. Oh, it didn't play.
It was trying to play, but can somebody else verify? Did you see the video playing, Rebecca? Yes. Okay.
Awesome. So we have this flash mob that breaks out while we're trick-or-treating, led by none other than Pennywise the clown, right? And they all start dancing to Thriller. And my older son, who is a really incredible dancer, we start seeing kids like go out and be part of the flash mob and interact, right? And I see in his eyes that he wants to be able to go out and do that. And so I was like, hey, why don't you go out and dance with Pennywise the clown? Like, wait, what am I actually saying here? Right? What mother is encouraging this? And so he goes out, or he thinks about going out. And he has this sort of sad look on his face. And he shakes his head no, that he's not going to go. He's not going to do it. And I asked him, why don't you want to go? And he said, well, I'm afraid I'm not going to do a good enough job. And I think this is so powerful for so many of us because there's so many times when we see an opportunity that is something we've been looking for, something we want to participate in, something we want to be or do or become. And yet when that opportunity presents itself, we find ourselves standing on the sidelines thinking, maybe I'm not ready. Maybe I'm not good enough. Maybe this isn't for me. Maybe I'm going to mess this up. And so I got down on his level and I looked into his eyes and I said, you know, Samson, it's my oldest son's name, there will be other opportunities to dance. But this opportunity isn't going to come again. So you get to decide what you want to do with this opportunity in your own storybook of life. What's the entry that you are going to make in this moment? And I saw his little face, think about it, compute this. And then he turned to me and said, Mom, hold my hand.
Sorry.
And he went out and danced. And I felt like the story was important to talk about because we're all in moments or will be in moments where something shows up in our lives and we want to reach for it and we want to be part of it. And yet maybe there's something that's holding us back. A sense of fear we have, a sense of not being good enough, a sense that this isn't ours or isn't meant for us. And yet, I think the humanity that we're creating across the globe is about all of us getting to be the very best versions of ourselves, getting to be a part of these moments that allow us to up-level and to uplift ourselves as well as others. Mm-hmm. And so when we think about opportunities, one of the things that we get to think through is this idea of fear and how fear shows up in our lives. And something that's not part of my bio that people read is that I'm dyslexic. And what I found is that I have to look very closely at words to determine which words I'm reading. And as I look at the word for scared and I look at the word for sacred, these are the exact same word, just with the C in a different place. And I've begun to think, what if in the wisdom of the English language, we're getting it wrong with this whole hashtag fearless thing and believing that in order to be successful or to make a meaningful contribution, we need to be free of fear. And what if instead we embraced our fear? What if we said, fear is not here to deter us. Fear is not here to run from, but actually to point us in the direction toward the most sacred opportunities that we have for our own development and growth. So what I want to encourage all of us to do is the next time that an opportunity presents itself, whether it's dancing with Pennywise on Halloween or something else, that even if we feel afraid about taking on that opportunity, that we don't allow fear to dissuade us. We don't allow fear to be a reason to not do something, but instead fear to be the marker of what might be the most sacred opportunity for our growth and development. And to know that fear is never going to leave, it's never going to go away. And so rather than being fearless, we get to embrace the idea of doing it scared. So now we're going to transition to Romina and I having a bit of a conversation and some Q&A, I believe. And I want to give you an opportunity to scan the QR code here. We're talking about creating a resilient movement. You know, this work that I've done for the last 20 years has been really focused on how it is we effectively address challenge, change, and complexity, and be able to create a more positive and productive outcome. And one of the things I'm so excited about in having these conversations and releasing the book is now all of this information that's been inside my head gets released out into the world. And rather than this being my own resilient cause, it becomes our collective resilient movement. And so you get to decide now, based on what you've learned today, how you're going to make this movement your own, how you're going to be a part of this. And so if you scan this code here, what it allows you to do is to download our free ebook, which is entitled Your Resilient Life. And it's going to give you all kinds of additional information on the 5 practices, how we effectively face challenge, change, and complexity, the myths and truths of resilience, and then how you can begin to incorporate those 5 practices in your life and tangible and practical tools for doing that on a daily basis.
Wow, that's wonderful. Dr. Taryn Marie, thank you so much for sharing. Can everybody hear me? There's some internet issues. There we go. That was a phenomenal talk, and we do have quite a few questions in the chat coming in. One of the questions, let me just pull this up, is more of an academic question, actually, I believe. So it's Nassim.
Oh, do we have someone with an advanced degree that can answer this?
Well, let me throw it at you and see what you think. So Nassim Nicholas Taleb uses the term anti-fragile, the gain of function from challenges. How does your expression of resilience compare, contrast, or align with this perspective?
That's a hot question. First of all, I love that anti-fragile and Nassim Taleb was brought into this conversation. So thank you. That's totally genius. And here's what I would say. In many ways, Taleb and I are incredibly aligned. And one of the ways that we have a sense of alignment is around this idea of challenge excavating within us a sense of strength and talent that maybe we didn't realize was there to begin with. And since I'm a language person, let me give you a language-based example. There's a lesser known word in the English language called silience. Silience. And silience means to uncover hidden strengths and talents within ourselves, right? And so when I think about silience, and then you put the re in front of that, resilience, right? I think one of the places that Taleb and I are aligned is this idea that when the 3 C's show up, challenge, change, and complexity, we get to be reminded of the talents, the strengths, the resources that we already have within ourselves. And that in that moment of challenge, we get to excavate those things to a greater degree. And whether we knew they were there, or we find them in the case of silience, or resilience is the emergence of challenge that actually reminds us of the core and the truth of how powerful and who we really are.
That's such a profound thought, and thank you for the new word, silience. Like to already have a sense that we have these hidden talents already in our beings, and that they are just to be brought out to help us face adversity. It's a very strength-based approach. It's very fascinating. It makes complete sense to me. Let's go on to another question. Thank you for whoever put that question in the chat. Why does society find it so hard to hear and hold our vulnerability?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think in many ways, vulnerability has been engineered out of us, right? There's been a lot of conversation about girls as they transition to being teenagers, say 12, 13, 14. They stop raising their hand, right? Their voice might diminish. They're no longer pursuing maybe math and science and some of the STEM-based educational work or careers. and that there's this sudden sense of being self-conscious, and not good enough, right? That emerges. And that's a really important conversation for us to be having around women and girls. Reshma Saujani, who some of you may be familiar with, who started the organization Girls Who Code, and she's written prolifically on this issue. A great book by her is called Brave Not Perfect. She talked about when girls are learning to code, they'll say, I don't know how to do it. And then the instructor will come over and like hit the back button a couple of times, and this beautiful string of code emerges that she's deleted because she's convinced herself that she can't do it, right? And then if we think about this for men and boys, in our society, we're actually cutting men and boys off from their vulnerability a decade earlier. When we say to little boys between the ages of 3 and 5, don't cry, be tough, stand back up, and we don't allow men and boys to access their emotions, right? And then 20 years later, they get into their first significant relationship, and their girlfriend's like, so how do you feel about that? Right? So in many ways, right, we're in this moment of society where I think some of our vulnerability gets engineered out of us. And what we get to do with men and boys from a parenting perspective is to allow them to access their emotions, and for that to be an important part of what it means to be in the full complement of the development of their masculinity. And for girls to reassure and to shore up, right, this sense of wholeness, in these moments when they get to being a teenager and we're feeling deeply, deeply self-conscious. I think vulnerability is also difficult for some of the reasons we mentioned, right? First and foremost, evolutionarily, right? From an evolutionary perspective, we wanted to keep ourselves safe because we didn't want to get cut off from the pack. We didn't want to be different than anyone else. And so that voice within our heads, the vulnerability bias, I believed, emerged as an evolutionary way to protect ourselves. But now, the way that we stay safe is not through, as I mentioned, typically physical protection, right? Because we've engineered a world in which we have houses and heat and grocery stores. Now, what keeps us safe and protected is human capital, it's human connection, right? And so when we demonstrate that sense of vulnerability, even though there's the prohibition of the vulnerability bias, that's actually what allows us to connect more deeply with others and shore up our mental health and our well-being. So I think those are some of the ways that our society has been structured in such a way that it's made it difficult to develop vulnerability.
Thank you. Yes, it's amazing to hear you say that it's the human connection that keeps us safe in an age where computers and screen time eat so much of our discretionary energy, right? And yet, so we're spending more time online, less time building relationships, less time in community. And so the social fabric that would keep us safe is eroded to an extent currently. And I heard you talk a little bit about, or made me think as you were talking about how we cut boys off a decade early, that naming emotions well is something that we as a society don't do very well. We have sort of 4 emotions that we use. I'm wondering, could you speak to that, the emotions wheel, or the use of that in sort of helping to understand what are we feeling in order that we can share it?
Yeah. There's a prerequisite to that question that I'd like to mention first, if that's okay. Actually, 2 prerequisites. The first prerequisite is emotions are like a faucet with one spigot, right? So sometimes what we do as humans is we're like, well, I don't like that emotion. That one feels pretty crappy, and I'm not cool with that one either. So we're just going to turn this thing off, right? But it's only one faucet. And so we can't only turn some emotions off and leave others, right? And so our emotional experience as humans is about getting comfortable with the vast array of emotions that we experience and holistically integrating those emotions, right? And sort of the second thing is building on that, right? Is we get to stop labeling our emotions and allowing some emotions to be good and other emotions to be bad, right? So I spoke to this a little bit with fear. Often we think of fear as a bad emotion, right? I don't want to feel this, right? Sadness, loss, heartbreak. For many people, women included, anger goes in that category. Like we're not allowed to be angry, right? And then we're sort of like, okay, well then I can experience this narrow, emotional experience. Right. Whereas if we get to think about to your point, Romina, like sort of the emotion wheel, right? This is the full complement of our human experience. And emotions get stuck in our body when we tell ourselves that we're not allowed to feel this, right? And so recognizing that there is no good or bad emotion, right? It's every emotion is simply a sense of energy, and it's simply a sense of information that we're getting about our lives and ourselves and where we have the opportunity to grow, right? And then I think we come to your point, Romina, which is the value, right, in being able to recognize within ourselves what we are feeling, being able to name it, being able to own it, right? And then that gives us the opportunity, right? Sort of becomes the conduit to say, okay, and how am I going to work through this?
Yeah, that's wonderful. It ties in so well with the teal paradigm and in self-management, how we're working towards being whole in the workplace, but also as managers stepping out of our comfort zone sometimes and embracing the emotions of our people at work. So when I mean, how many people here have cried in the workplace, right? I mean, I think some of us, yeah. There have been so many occasions where I've seen women specifically run to the bathroom and I'm like, uh-oh, what just happened? And, there's not an embracing of emotions in the workplace, of wholeness yet, where there's a comfort level. And I think some of it has to do with that emotional fluency that you were speaking to, Dr. Taryn Marie, around the naming of emotions, but also being able to share our stories and being able to be vulnerable with each other. There's another question. Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Can I just add on to that for a second? Because what I don't want to also ignore is that these things don't happen in a vacuum, right? We are very much, when we think about our workplaces, living inside of an existing organizational culture. And that organizational culture is informed by all of the biases, stereotypes, gender discrepancies, generalizations or overgeneralizations that exist, right, sort of in our society and in our world, right? And while I would love to say, it's okay for women to burst into tears at work, I think in the vast number of cultures that women are working and living within across the globe, like you're not wrong to run to the bathroom, right? Because it's very, very easy for women to be labeled as being emotional, or that we can't handle the problem, or we're not sort of fit, for the job. So I think what we're talking about around how we experience our emotions as humans holistically is really powerful. And then I think when we layer on the idea of the workplace at this moment, right, in many workplaces, it's aspirational.
Right. That brings me to the next question, actually, which is somebody has found that displaying vulnerability is contagious. And if they do it, someone else is more likely to do the same. She or he is wondering if that's true in your experience.
It absolutely is. It absolutely is. generally vulnerability can be contagious. It's especially contagious when it's done well by someone in leadership, right?
Yeah.
I have people that come to me and say, my organization doesn't like vulnerability or doesn't allow for vulnerability. And I'm like, well, vulnerability at its core is really about us as humans being able to connect honestly, authentically, empathetically with one another. Now, what organization is going to say they don't like that, right? Probably not many.
Yeah.
I think the place where vulnerability gets scary for people is, how do we go about doing that in an effective way inside of our workforce, right? So let me give you an example about this. So I was coaching an executive, right? And what do we do to our high potential leaders inside of our organizations? We give them cross-functional promotions. We're like, okay, we appreciate that you've been in marketing for 20 years. That's amazing. We see a huge future for you inside of this company. So we're going to drop you over here in operations, something that you know nothing about. You have no social capital in this area. And we're going to see how you do. High potential. Good luck to you. Right? So she was in this moment of a cross-functional rotation where she was going from marketing to operations. And what she said to me is, she's like, I'm just going to go in, I'm going to meet with the team, and I'm going to say, I have no idea what I'm doing. I don't know anything about operations. I have so much to learn, and I hope they'll help me get up to speed. I'm just going to be vulnerable, right? And I was like, yeah, that's not vulnerability. That's discrediting yourself, right? So let's try again, right? And so what she ultimately said was, hey, I've been with this organization for 2 decades. I've got a tremendous background relative to marketing. And now I have this amazing opportunity to learn an entire new area of the organization in operations. And I've got so much to learn. I'm excited about getting to work with this team and what we're going to accomplish together. And I want to invite you all to be part of my onboarding process and to support, me in coming on board and being an effective leader. And also for us to work collectively together to accomplish these big goals.
Wow. That's so emboldening, what you just shared. And I want to thank you again, Dr. Taryn Marie. I was going to say Marin Therese.
I like that hybrid that you did there. I see what you did, and I'm going to think about adopting.
On behalf of all of us today, thank you so much for the gift of your stories, your knowledge sharing, all the questions that you've answered, and for all of your wisdom and brilliance. If you would like to continue to debrief this session or keep on chatting, you can join me in Spatial Chat. I'll put the link in Spatial Chat again. Dr. Marie, we could keep on talking to you all day. So thanks again for being here.